Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are. And welcome to the session entitled Programmatic Shifts Within MCC Over a Century. My name is Ruth Plett. I am the Associate Director of MCC Canada's Peace and Justice Office, and I will be chairing this session. I would invite all conference participants to introduce yourselves in the chat so we get to know a bit more about who is here, since we can't see all your lovely faces. For this session, we are honored to have 3 different presenters, including a very gracious last-minute addition to this session. I will give a fuller bio of each presenter in turn before their presentation, but just to give you a sense of what we are hoping to cover in this session, Lynn Longenecker will examine key approaches MCC has taken to educational work over the past century. He will also explore concerns raised by MCC workers about the education system and MCC's ongoing search for ways to support education that truly contribute to MCC's mission. Paul Shetler-Fast will be presenting on the evolution of MCC's health programming in Haiti over its 63 years in the country, from 1958 till 2021, and how the history parallels broader trends in MCC's approach to its work globally. Timothy Gachanga will be presenting on the Community Peace Museums of Kenya, a concept that he calls an MCC innovation. Timothy was initially set to present on Saturday, and we're grateful for his flexibility in being added to this session at the 11th hour. While he didn't prepare his presentation with the specific theme of programmatic shifts within MCC over a century in mind, it nevertheless fits within the larger framework of this discussion. And I think all 3 presentations will give us ample food for thought. Before we get started with the first presentation, a couple of logistical notes for those of you who might be joining the conference for the first time with this session. One reminder is that the Q&A function, which is found at the bottom of your screen, is the way that we are hoping that you can pose questions to various presenters throughout the session. I'll be doing my best to monitor those both during the presentations and during the Q&A portion. Once the presentations are complete, I will also invite folks to bring questions by simply unmuting yourself. And just a reminder to please remember to identify yourself as well as to whom your question is directed when asking. And then the chat function is used more for if there's a particular comment that you need everyone in the space to know. But if it's questions about the presentation, let's use the Q&A function for that. So without further ado, let's turn to the presentations. We are going to start with the presentation that is largest in scope, both in geography and time, and move in turn to the more specific, both in terms of context and in terms of time period, which means that we will be starting with Lynn Longenecker. Lynn is the Education Coordinator for Mennonite Central Committee, coordinating MCC's support for education partners around the world for the past 10 years since 2011. Prior to that, he worked for MCC in Bolivia and Guatemala, and was a high school math teacher and K-12 technology integration coordinator at a school in Pennsylvania. He has compiled issues of MCC's Intersections publication on topics of community participation in education, child protection, and education for transformation. Over to you, Lynn.
Okay, thank you, Ruth. So I've called this MCC and Education, a Century of Learning. Throughout its history, MCC has supported learning opportunities for millions of people. In the process, MCC has passed through its own arc of transformational learning as new experiences opened workers' eyes, leading many to see themselves in a new light and even rethink their most basic assumptions about education itself. MCC has supported education by sending teachers to places of need, providing scholarships for students, shipping school kits, and working to strengthen local partner schools. This has been driven by a belief that education improves people's lives, individually and collectively, by building knowledge, skills, and values that prepare people for vocations and empower them to find new solutions to community problems. While this belief still holds, MCC workers have also learned that formal schooling has often brought unintended negative impacts. In her 1977 reflection on integrating education and development, Nancy Heisey reached this staggering conclusion, quote, "We have seen that education, defined as schooling, is one of the roots of the development problem for nations struggling with the demands of a modern world," end quote. Heise's reflection came only 15 years after MCC began intensive support for formal education as a key solution for problems in Africa. So a root of the problem or a key solution. This review will examine the variety of approaches MCC has taken to educational work over the past century. It will also explore concerns raised by MCC workers like Heise and MCC's ongoing search for ways to support education that truly contribute to MCC's mission rather than being a root of the problem. Does that come through well for you? All right.
Yeah,
MCC's first few decades focused on famine relief in Russia, the resettlement of Mennonite refugees to Paraguay, and relief for war-affected areas of Europe. Education was not the primary focus, but was sometimes part of these efforts, such as by supporting children's homes in Europe or schools in the Mennonite colonies in Paraguay. At this stage, education was seen more as a tool for shaping values and identity, rather than as a tool for development. Interestingly, this was mostly inward-looking, with a mindset toward shaping the values and identity of its own Mennonite people and workers. For example, in the 1940s, some teachers in the Paraguayan Mennonite schools were using their influence to promote Germany's National Socialist or Nazi ideology among young people in the colonies. This raised concern and generated calls for finding teachers who were, quote, loyal to Mennonite Christian principles. In a 1946 report, MCC's director in Paraguay recommended that MCC should, quote, use its influence in the direction of securing the right kind of teachers, end quote. You can learn much more about this in the recent issue of Intersections and things that were discussed in the last session. That's not the focus of this presentation, so I won't go into more detail here. But that's an example. This understanding of education as a tool for shaping values and identity was also reflected in MCC-operated alternative service programs in the 1940s and 50s. Mennonite leaders recognized that alternative service terms had life-changing effects on Mennonite young adults and began to intentionally create orientations, trainings, and curricula to strengthen the commitment to traditional Mennonite convictions. The MCC Peace Section was established in 1942, in part to, quote, aid our churches in the education of the youth in the ways of peace and non-resistance, in keeping with our confession of faith as based on the word of God. The model of service learning has continued to be embraced as a core part of MCC's work throughout its history and impacted thousands of young people. The IVEP program began in 1950, followed by SALT and summer service in the 1980s, and other programs in recent decades, together forming what is now the Global Service Learning Department. From the 1950s onwards, MCC began a new era of supporting education with a more outward-looking mindset as a tool for economic development. In 1954, MCC began paying education costs for orphaned boys in Korea. This program of individual scholarships to help children access formal education soon expanded to other countries. These scholarships were funded by individual donors who received regular supports about the children they supported. This model eventually came to be known as Global Family, growing to over 2,000 students per year by 1968 and continuing for nearly 50 years in different forms. MCC wrestled with tensions related to the sponsorship model. On the one hand, it generated strong interest from supporters because of the sense of connection it created with the impact of their donations, and it provided life-changing educational opportunities for many thousands of children. On the other hand, the individual sponsorship model tended to cultivate a paternalistic dynamic between giver and receiver. It created challenges related to participant selection, and added a significant administrative load for MCC staff to facilitate individual connections. In the early 2000s, MCC stopped producing reports for donors about individual children, instead providing reports about MCC's work with whole education programs. In 2016, MCC changed its donor relations strategy further and discontinued the global family branding completely, though the projects it supported still continue. MCC also supported education as a tool for development by placing teachers in schools. The first large-scale example of this was in Newfoundland and Labrador in Canada, beginning in 1956. Building on this experience, MCC established the Teachers Abroad program, or TAP, in 1962 in response to a call from newly independent African nations who believed formal education was the key to economic development and modernization. TAP eventually placed over 200 teachers per year, providing over 2,800 teacher service years. I like that metric. Over a quarter century, primarily in countries across Africa, but with some also in Bolivia and Jamaica. MCC also placed many teachers across the United States during the 60s and 70s through the voluntary service program. I'm gonna stop my share for a moment. The reflections of MCC teachers about their work tell the story of MCC's own education as an organization. Most of these teachers were white, Mennonite, college graduates, kind of like me, driven by a desire to make the world a better place and inspired by the values of peace and justice, nurtured by Mennonite colleges, churches, and MCC itself. They went out with the best of intentions and visions of what they could accomplish. Yet their service experiences prompted critical questions and turned their worlds upside down. Put bluntly, for many MCC teachers, their most transformative education came from learning to see their own internalized, subconscious sense of superiority over the people they were there to serve. And I own this as my own story as well, though it maybe came 30 years later. Whether in post-colonial Africa or in the white supremacist context of the United States, white MCC teachers began to realize that while education had potential to empower and liberate, it too often instead shaped students in their teacher's image and imposed the values and patterns of the dominant white North American European system. By 1970, a TAP report from Kenya recognized this dynamic and described a hope for a gradual emergence of a, quote, education system which is more authentically Kenyan in character and purpose, end quote. In 1977, Nancy Heisey wrote her analysis of education and development that I mentioned earlier, highlighting fundamental problems of the education system which MCC supported. This system cultivated values of individualism and consumerism, reinforced a worldview of white Western superiority, and fostered a society in which an elite few succeed, while the majority are discarded and left unprepared for a vocation or life in a rural context. Such educational systems intensified rather than diminished inequality between rich and poor, an observation that led to Heisey's conclusion that formal schooling was, quote, one of the roots of the development problem. The lessons of this era led to a slightly more humble, self-critical approach by MCC. When MCC began sending English teachers to China in the early 1980s, the language was markedly different than when the first TAP teachers were sent to Africa 20 years earlier. Instead of, I'm assuming my screen comes through again, let me know if it doesn't. Instead of, quote, helping emerging nations compress a century of development into the span of a decade, or helping the local Protestant churches and overseas missions to inherit the land. The new China Education Exchange was described in 1982 as, quote, an unusual opportunity for learning and serving in this moment of history. This is a venture of faith. In this program is the expectation, joy, and wonder of growth. Neither do our Chinese friends nor we know how these exchanges, where these exchanges will lead. In 1990, an All-Africa Education Conference in Lesotho brought together MCC staff and African educators and church leaders to evaluate MCC's involvement in African formal education. The report from this conference echoed Heise's earlier critiques and concluded with the assertion that, quote, MCC must listen to what Africans are saying, end quote. The conference seemed to both acknowledge the flaws in the education system and affirm that MCC should stay engaged and support African efforts to reshape the system. This cartoon by Frato is a great illustration of that flawed system. I keep it on the wall by my desk, along with the question, is education a tool for liberation or a tool for oppression? Despite this question and the risk of negative impact, MCC has continued to support education efforts because we believe that at its best, education absolutely does have the potential to be a tool of liberation that brings life-changing transformation. Several years ago, I made this attempt to describe what that transformation looks like and answer the question of why I still believe education can be a core solution rather than a root of the problem. When education is most transformative, it produces people who are empowered with a new perspective and filled with love. If I'm empowered, I have knowledge and skills to affect the world around me. I can think creatively and imagine solutions to conflicts and challenges. Translate the words on this mural in the picture, say, we are active, not passive. We are the solution, not a problem to be solved. If I have a new perspective, I'm aware of my own assumptions. I recognize that other people have different points of view that are also valid. I believe that I am neither inferior nor superior to others. If I am filled with love, I know that God loves me and my neighbor. I use my skills to benefit all, not just myself. I have found healing from my own pain to break the cycle of violence. If we're honest, some MCC-supported education efforts might look more like Frato's cartoon than this vision, but this is the vision that inspires me to continue supporting education as a tool for achieving our mission. And I think there are many examples of where this has happened and is happening. Returning to finish our journey through MCC's 100 years, in the most recent quarter century, MCC began emphasizing the ideas of partnership and local ownership. On the left here is a MCC partner in Democratic Republic of Congo. On the right is the gathering of a school management committee at a rural school in Nepal. In this era of partnership, MCC's role in education shifted from directly placing teachers or implementing scholarship programs to helping local schools and organizations do their work more effectively. MCC support now often comes in the form of grants to help partners buy materials, pay for activities, pay local teachers and staff, provide professional development, reduce student fees, and more. In settings where it is difficult to purchase supplies locally, MCC directly provides school kits, which are generously donated by supporters and processed at the many material resource centers. Records show that MCC has distributed nearly 3 million school kits since 1979. MCC staff facilitate reflective learning processes, commonly called planning, monitoring, and evaluation. to help ensure accountability and to capture lessons learned that can strengthen the work or be shared with other partners. Recent emphases within MCC's education program include providing quality education for uprooted and displaced children, as well as those who face barriers due to gender and ethnicity. Other important themes are strengthening child safeguarding practices, increasing parent and community involvement in school management committees, making education more relevant by focusing on practical vocational skills and peace education, in addition to traditional academic areas, building teacher capacity to work with children who have experienced trauma, and mitigating the devastating impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on children's education, most recently. The emphasis on local ownership results in great diversity in MCC-supported education ventures. We can't point to one single prototypical MCC project. Rather, education partners today and in recent decades include early childhood education centers, primary and secondary schools, after-school programs, vocational training, peace education, and education for children with disabilities. Within this, there are also different types of partnership models that I want to talk about just a bit. Four broad examples I want to highlight. First is partnership with organizations who give targeted support for individual students. For example, in Democratic Republic of Congo, MCC partners with church organizations who collaborate with local public schools to provide targeted individual funding for displaced children to attend school. They also provide some interventions to improve the quality for all students in those schools, like desks, supplies, and training for teachers on how to support students who have experienced trauma. The second model is partnership with private schools. So for example, in Kenya, Mukuru Mennonite Academy, MCC provides a large percentage of operating costs for a primary school located in what they call a slum area of Nairobi. The budget includes teacher salaries, training, supplies, and organizational strengthening. The third model is partnership with public schools or organizations that work in public schools. So for example, in India, our partner Tomorrow's Foundation is a local NGO that works to improve the quality of 25 government primary schools in Kolkata. Their work includes pedagogy training for teachers, activating, this photo is a group of teachers participating in a training, activating school management committees for stronger community involvement, and adaptations to support learning during the pandemic shutdown. Another example of this model is in Nicaragua, a partner who is a local NGO who's doing peace education in 11 public schools in a region with high levels of violence. And the fourth model is partnership with non-formal programs that are separate from formal schools. And this example is from Lebanon. Our partner, House of Light and Hope, runs a non-formal program that provides remedial classes and psychosocial support for Syrian refugees and local at-risk Lebanese girls. You can see that these are very different models. These are the four types of models structurally. Each has strengths and weaknesses, so it's important to analyze those. Some of the key aspects we consider include whether the model increases access to education or improves its quality, or both. Whether the model strengthens the local system, or whether it helps fill the gaps in the local system. The potential for scaling up the project, the potential for sustainability after MCC support ends. No one model achieves all these goals, and MCC has not defined one preferred model, but rather chosen to work with what makes most sense in each local context. However, there are some general trends in recent decades. I'll highlight 3 of them. One is a shift from focus on access to quality, recognizing that it's not enough to only help children be in school. It's also important to make sure that they're learning. Second is a shift from individual to whole school support. While targeted individual support is sometimes appropriate, we have a more systemic impact if we strengthen the whole school or program. And finally, a shift from private to public school partners. Private schools can do a great job of filling gaps in the system, but can easily put MCC into a position of being stuck where the school is dependent on continued funding with no good way to exit. Public schools have a more sustainable financial structure, a more permanent part of the local system. So this model is a way to strengthen the local system, which will remain after MCC partnership ends. Despite these broad trends, there are many exceptions, depending on the specific details of each context. So MCC listens carefully to local partners as we keep searching for the best ways to support education as a tool for achieving our mission. In closing, I hope this overview has helped show how learning has been a core part of MCC's history. As MCC has simultaneously worked to provide learning opportunities for others and intentionally learned from its own experience. It's exciting to imagine what new opportunities and lessons are waiting in the years ahead. Thank you, Ruth.
Thank you, Lynn. And now over to Paul Shetler-Fast. Paul is the Global Health Coordinator for Mennonite Central Committee, helping to oversee, support, and coordinate MCC's health and public health programming with local partners around the world. Paul and his wife, Rebecca, served with MCC in Haiti from 2015 to 2020. He is also an affiliate faculty of public health at Goshen College. Paul recently published a chapter on his experience serving in Haiti in a book entitled The Humanitarian Machine, Reflection from Practice. Over to you, Paul.
Thank you, Ruth, and thank you all for being here. It's a real joy to be with you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're calling from. Greetings from Goshen, Indiana. It's great to be with you, to have the opportunity today to share about 2 topics that I'm passionate about: MCC's health programming and the specific context of Haiti. And what I hope to do in my presentation today is to give you a broad sense of how MCC's health work in Haiti evolved over its 63-year history from 1958 to today, to explain a bit about why we see the evolution of programming approaches that we do, and hopefully point to some learnings that may be useful more broadly as we think about MCC's full spectrum of program work and where it may be headed in its 2nd century. So I want to start out with a bit of a disclaimer that this story is also personal. This story of 60+ years of health work in Haiti is reflected in some ways by 2 individual people from the same family who served in leadership roles with MCC in Haiti, coming from 2 very different approaches to health. The first is John Bender, my grandfather, who was the medical doctor who came to Haiti in 1959 with his family to start the Grand Riviera du Nord Hospital, which is pictured here. This hospital would provide the primary medical care to an area of more than 80,000 people for the next 2 decades and define much of MCC's early work in Haiti. And then there was me, a public health person who came to Haiti as a country rep with my wife and my family nearly 60 years later, representing a different way of supporting communities in their search for health. Our story today is in some ways about how and why we got from point A to point B. But this is not necessarily a linear story, and we want to acknowledge and also the complexity of this history. The Grand Riviera du Nord Hospital was the signature MCC project of its early decades in Haiti, and the Grand Riviera effort itself represented activities that span the full spectrum of approaches to health programming that I'll be discussing today. Grand Riviera was founded by MCC with the goal of directly providing desperately needed medical care to an underserved part of the country. The original plan there was to take over a half-built facility that had been funded by the US government, but never completed, and was now owned by the Haitian Ministry of Health. To supply all the core medical staff, originally a doctor and 3 nurses, to maintain and upgrade the facility to provide all the necessary supplies and equipment. This was medical relief work at its core, flying in external expatriate staff, supplies, equipment, and methods of care to treat the acute needs of an underserved population. The results were tangible and direct, and this basic model of health programming would be the major emphasis in the first 1/3 of MCC's history in Haiti. And yet, even in his first year on the ground, my grandfather acknowledged that this approach alone was never going to be enough. In a letter back to MCC leadership in Akron in 1959, Dr. Bender wrote that, quote, "There are always overwhelming healthcare needs at Grand Riviera." He described how on the first day they opened the clinic, it consisted of nothing more than makeshift tables and chairs in 2 unfinished rooms of the structure open to the sky, with limited drugs and dressings, no medical equipment available, and only a partial team. Despite not advertising the clinic, huge crowds assembled these first days. He writes that we treated 71 patients the first day and 101 the next. But even as the team celebrated the medical aid that was being provided, Bender noted that from the beginning, more people were always turned away than they could ever see. As he wrote, quote, "We do what we can, but it is never enough. We are overwhelmed by the multitudes of sick and destitute patients and the inadequacy of our resources. Only treating problems after they developed medically is never going to be enough." And here we see the turn towards the other 2 models of intervention that would dominate the second and third eras of MCC's health work in Haiti, building more sustainable local health delivery systems and working at upstream prevention of disease through community-led public health. Within the first 2 years of work at Grand Riviera, early moves in these directions could be seen. Haitian doctors began to be placed at the hospital on rotation for training and to increase staffing. A plan was developed to eventually create a local hospital structure and staffing that could be turned over to local leadership, which eventually did happen in 1978 when the hospital was formally turned over to the Haitian Ministry of Health. Similarly, early community public health work was launched to train and support local traditional birth attendants, provide clean water and sanitation, and improve nutrition. And while these early efforts at public health were not community-led, they were definitely expatriate-led, they represented early steps in the development of this model that would eventually come to dominate MCC's approach to health work in Haiti and globally. So the story of Grand Riviera's early years is a microcosm of the broader evolution of MCC's health programming in Haiti, which itself is a microcosm of the broader trends we see globally across MCC. Here's what I'd like to share with you today. First, we will look at the 3 broad approaches to health programming that have been used across MCC's 63 years in Haiti, which I've touched on briefly already. These are 1, providing medical relief and direct care. This is short-term clinical health interventions and medical material resources meant to address immediate health needs through mostly imported resources. 2, building local health delivery systems. This includes construction of health facilities, training and supporting local staff, developing and expanding clinical services in more durable ways. And 3, facilitating community-led public health, taking a secondary role in supporting and facilitating community-led public health prevention work, including water and sanitation, preventive health education, and community-based maternal and child health programming to keep mothers and kids out of the health system in the first place. And as we try to understand these 3 approaches and make sense of how and why MCC shifted strategies over time, 3 key tensions provide a helpful lens on what has been behind these shifts: immediate needs versus long-term impact, technical expertise versus contextual expertise, control versus local ownership. And finally, at the end of the presentation, I'll talk a little about how this case study connects with the broader global trends in MCC's health work over this period and what it may mean for our future. So if we look at these 3 main approaches to health in Haiti, It is important to understand how they fit together and overlapped over time. These are not wholly distinct phases or mutually exclusive categories, but somewhat overlapping strategies that were emphasized to a greater or lesser degree in different times. One way of understanding the difference between the approaches is to look at their primary staffing model, the primary measures of success. Medical relief, for example, uses primarily expatriate clinicians and imported resources and measures success in terms of patients treated. In contrast, building local health systems involves a staged transition from expatriate to local staff, with an emphasis on training, and success in the long term often measured in terms of number of clinics or hospitals established and the number of local staff trained. Finally, community-led public health works through local partners and local staff and measures success upstream in the prevention of disease and suffering. I've also included here a rough decade by decade visualization for when these approaches were more or less prominent in MCC's health work in Haiti. You can see medical relief was how we started in Haiti and was dominant for 2 decades before fading out in the 1980s. It resurfaces briefly after the 2010 earthquake, but is currently not part of our work in Haiti. Building local health systems begins slowly in the 1960s, becoming our dominant strategy in the 70s and 80s, before declining in emphasis rapidly in the 90s. Only recently have we done anything resembling this approach, as some of our community public health work grew organically into reinforcing community mental health delivery systems. And finally, our public health work started slowly in the early years and gradually picked up speed and became more and more community-led over time. And this is now the dominant approach that is used in Haiti and globally. So I want to give you a few snapshots of what the medical relief and direct care model looks like in practice. And I've already shared one with you earlier of my grandfather's work at Grand Riviera Hospital in 1959. Here at the bottom right, we see a picture of Nurse Ann Eby, also at Grand Riviera, holding a baby she was caring for. By the 1960s, when Ann was working there, the hospital had expanded to 24 beds, was always filled to capacity, treating about 3,000 people per month with the best care available in that part of the country. The larger picture on the left is from the 1990s and shows MCC service worker and nurse practitioner Margaret De Jong checking in on Madame Apollon, the mother of the triplets De Jong helped deliver along the road outside Bois-de-Laurence, Haiti. Their names were Wilmer, Wilson, and Exon, and without that right person with the right expertise walking along at exactly the right time, they likely would not have survived. And finally, on the upper left, you see Rhonda Usis, a nurse from California, taking the blood pressure of Lafayette Francois, a survivor of the 2010 earthquake in Port-au-Prince, as part of the medical team that came down shortly after that disaster. This was the last example of MCC using this approach to health in Haiti. The ability to directly and quickly help people who were suffering was and is the major appeal of medical relief and direct care work. And while MCC no longer relies on this approach, many other organizations do, including medical missions and major NGOs like Doctors Without Borders. The primary reasons MCC moved away from this model were, one, it is by definition unsustainable. The needs are overwhelming, and relying on imported solutions is only ever a temporary help. We heard this already in Dr. Bender's quote earlier. Two, it creates what one service worker placed at Hospital Albert Schweitzer in Haiti described as, quote, a revolving door of expat volunteers, where there can be few deep friendships with locals ever formed and little understanding of the context. And three, it has strong colonial and paternalistic overtones. As one service worker described this model as at its purest as, quote, a colonial slice of American medicine dropped in rural Haiti. Now, Albert Schweitzer was a well-funded private hospital that MCC provided staffing to for decades in Haiti, and it was probably the clearest example of this model. Dr. Sue Brown, who served with MCC in the 70s, 80s, and again in 2010, described HAS, or Hospital Albert Schweitzer, as it was so out of place. They had a swimming pool, milk, ice cream, refrigeration. We would send our kids to HAS as a kind of a camp, Camp des Chapelles, we would call it. The land and the buildings were originally a colonial outpost of the United Fruit Company, and the houses there were beautiful old United Fruit manager houses. And something of that original feel never left, she says. Quote, I had heard that the electricity budget to run the air conditioning at HAS at the time was more than the Haitian government's entire health budget. And then people wondered why the quality of care was different between local and expat-run hospitals, end quote. The weaknesses of the medical relief model led logically toward trying to build local health delivery systems that could eventually be fully locally run. This was built in from the beginning to the idea behind the Grand Riviera Hospital, which you can see on the left. It was a Ministry of Health hospital that theoretically would be jointly staffed by MCC and the Ministry of Health and eventually fully turned over to locals. But for many years, that was just a plan on paper. Even in the 1970s, when Dr. Sue Brown was working at Grand Riviera, she noted that, quote, there had been an agreement with the government to provide docs, but that was very unreliable. You could never count on there being a doctor there, so MCC always felt responsible to staff it. The government may not have had enough people, but trying to actually turn over to local control was an extreme challenge and frustration, end quote. However, in 1978, that transition actually did happen. And in 1980, MCC left Grand Riviera, and today that hospital is still thriving under 100% local staffing and local leadership. The picture on the top right is of Hospital Albert Schweitzer. This hospital was supported with MCC staff from the late 1950s to 1989, and it represents both the success of the medical relief model and a cautionary tale of how hard turning over to local ownership can be. For decades, HAS provided the best medical care in Haiti with a fully expat leadership and control structure, generous foreign money and medical resources, and mostly expat clinicians. While the resources flowed, it was possible to import a fairly high standard of care. But there was always odd cultural dissonance in some decisions that were created by having a fully expatriate leadership and control structure. For example, HAS for many years did not admit pregnant women or start a maternity ward, quote, because we would have been overwhelmed by patients. And this is a decision wildly out of step with how Haitians would have prioritized who should receive care first. Similarly, the model of a geographic catchment area made perfect sense to foreigners for trying to manage demand for services. So HAS had and still has a geographically based fee schedule, leading to in-groups getting highly subsidized care and out-groups perhaps just living across the street with exorbitant fees designed to turn them away. And this again made little sense in a local culture that would never define the need or the right to treatment based on the randomness of location. HAS tried to turn over ownership of the management of the hospital to MCC. We wisely declined, noting the deeply ingrained hierarchical patterns at the hospital and the weak groundwork that had been laid for localization and sustainability. HAS is currently under semi-local control, but is no longer the gold standard of care that it once was. And finally, at the bottom right, you see Noelle Derenis. She's in the center, who's successfully being treated for major depression outside her home in La Jolla, Haiti. She is standing with her team of community mental health workers, Joseph Benissois and Saint-Hilaire Olisson. They work with MCC partner Zami La Santé, which thanks in part to MCC's support now provides community and clinic-based mental health services for about a third of Haiti. MCC's work to support this community mental health system emerged out of our growing community-led public mental health work. At its best, this model is about empowering, training, supporting local health providers and leaders to develop sustainable healthcare delivery systems in line with local priorities and values. But in practice, it can be very hard to transition away from dependent hierarchical systems and imported models of care. The greatest success was always found when this localization was the goal and the strategy from the start. Trying to dump foreign-run systems on locals when the funding runs out has nearly always been a disaster. And finally, the model of community-led public health, which is now the dominant model within Haiti, within MCC's work in Haiti, and with MCC globally. I'll give you a few quick examples of what this work looks like in practice to demonstrate and contrast with the other models. The first is our child malnutrition work in the rural mountains of the Artibonite with our local partner, Combit Paysan. 100% of the staff in these projects are local to the communities being served. And the idea and model of the intervention was designed by a local team of nurses. The idea was that child malnutrition services up until that time were entirely hospital-based and very inaccessible to the families that needed them most, particularly poor single mothers who could not afford to stop working or pay for food or lodging, let alone medicine, while their child was in an inpatient setting. There was also shame for your kids needing hospital care for malnutrition, and many mothers waited until it was too late to take their children in. The model these nurses developed was community-based, to take care to the mothers early, before the kids were critically sick and when they could recover at home with minimal supports. One of the nurses, Adeline, who started this program, said, "Why does love only start when a child becomes ill?" Support groups were formed to reduce stigma, and this work was linked in with the agricultural and income generation work MCC was doing to help mothers not only bring their kids back to health, but ensure they had the resources in the long run, never to end up in that situation again. This relatively cheap, locally led model meant 95% of even acutely malnourished kids recovered successfully at home, up from 20% before the project. And one of these success stories is Luis Vesta. She's seen here holding her daughter, Wilda, who would have at the very least required inpatient hospitalization without the program. Other examples include community-led sanitation and hygiene work, water work that ended cholera in the target communities in less than 6 months with simple, cheap interventions like locally built latrines, hand washing stations, and mobilizing everyone from pastors to teachers to farmers to be champions of behavior change. And we also see here Emma, right here, Emma Themistock, head of the Women's Rights Center in Beaumont, who works with her team of local volunteers to mobilize the community to prevent sexual and gender-based violence and to provide wraparound supports to survivors if violence occurs. These are models of responding upstream to problems which have been identified as priorities by the communities in ways that put local staff and leaders in the driver's seat to design interventions to fit local culture, designed around cultural and contextual strengths. And now, stepping back a bit, I want to briefly mention 3 tensions that I think underlie much of this history. And these are not fully resolved in MCC. And it is not to say that one end of these spectrums is good and the other one bad. Rather, they reflect conflicting values and priorities. But we can see a broad shift over time in how MCC looked at these competing priorities. We see first here medical relief, which I have listed as MR, coming down strongly on the far side of each of these tensions. On the side of meeting immediate needs, prioritizing imported technical expertise, technical solutions, and maintaining strict control over every aspect of the program, often in the name of quality control. Next, we see health systems work, moving significantly more toward longer-term impact, and at least ideally toward local empowerment. However, the technical model does not really change, and local empowerment is only supported as long as it follows the centrally set plan and international standards of care. And finally, we see public health moving further down each of these continuums, valuing longer-term impacts through preventative work, but still wanting to see results often within a 3-year project cycle. Valuing more contextual expertise and localization of models of care, but not fully giving up on best practices and standards of care. And yes, moving down the spectrum of local empowerment with a local staffing model, local leadership, and community ownership. And we see the same broad trend globally in MCC's health work, and actually in many cases across sectors. And you may see resonance of this in what Lynn shared. But where does MCC go from here? I think the move toward more and more local empowerment and ownership is here to stay, and rightly so. It leads to better, more locally adapted programming, better sustainability, and greater resilience to shocks like COVID-19. On what type of expertise is valued, I think we still feel these tensions deeply with the pull between the values of technical expertise and international best practices. In some ways, that's the only reason someone like me has a job in my role. And the desire, on the other hand, to be fully locally adapted, responsive to highly local contexts, priorities, and cultures. I think one takeaway from this case study history is that we should at least be skeptical of how much weight should be placed on technical expertise and whether this is in some cases merely a convenient excuse for control. And finally, I think we will always be torn in balancing long versus short-term impacts. It is ethically difficult to deprioritize immediate suffering when faced with real people with real urgent needs. Yet it is also ethically problematic to continually apply Band-Aids when we know that upstream work could potentially prevent the wounds from forming in the first place. My guess from the Haiti experience is that the more we move toward contextual expertise and local empowerment, the more we will give up control of this last continuum of temporality and allow our local partners the discretion of when and where it makes sense to address urgent needs and when longer term fixes are a priority. This, for example, is what the Haiti team did in designing MCC's response to the recent earthquake in August. And while it may not yield the decision folks on the outside might assume, I think it has the potential to do much more good in the long run. I'll stop here as I think I've already taken up more than my time, and look forward to questions and conversation after.
Thanks, Paul. Now we're going to turn to Timothy Gachanga. Timothy Gachanga is a Kenyan. He teaches peace and conflict studies at Tangaza University College in Kenya. He is also an adjunct lecturer at Kenyatta University, where he teaches security management and policing studies. Since 2002, Gachanga has been working with the community peace museums, where he has seen it grow from a material culture project to the Community Peace Museum's Heritage Foundation. Between 2011 and 2018, he served as an advisory board member of the International Network of Museums of Peace, INMP. He is currently a special advisor to the INMP board. Gachanga has published various book chapters and journal articles on peace and peace museums. We're glad to have Timothy with us today, though he has actually created a recording of his presentation. He was just worried about the internet connection, and so just bear with me as I get this video recording started for us. So just a moment here. And before I hit play, if I could have one of the panelists show your video so that you can just give me a thumbs up to let me know that you actually hear the sound as I get started, that would be really helpful. So either maybe Paul or Lynn, would one of you be willing to do that? Thanks, Lynn. Okay, let's give this a try.
I take this opportunity to greet all of you. I am glad to be part of this celebration when the global community is celebrating 100 years of Mennonites' response to the biblical call to love your neighbor through acts of service. I'm Timothy Gachanga, and I'm presenting this from Nairobi, Kenya. This celebration is about reflecting on MCC response to the global call to love one's neighbor through acts of service. And I'm glad to have interacted with the Mennonite Central Committee for over 10 years. And what I'm presenting today is part of this reflection. And my reflection today is on how MCC has worked with the community peace museums, the challenges that MCC had to overcome to make sure that peace museums play a role in reconciling communities in Kenya and in East Africa. Allow me to share my slide so that I can give my presentation. So this is my presentation. It is entitled Community Peace Museums of Kenya and MCC Innovation. I have worked with the Community Peace Museums for over 10 years. I joined the Community Peace Museums in 2002. By then I was a volunteer. And I must say that I was impressed by how our Mennonite Central Committee worked with the communities in Kenya. And I see involvement of the Mennonite Central Committee as a call to love one's neighbor through acts of service. And I'm saying this because by the time community peace museums were established, that was in 1987, this region was experiencing conflicts. There was conflict in Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Ethiopia, Somalia, and Sudan. And many efforts had been made to broker peace, but they were not yielding fruit, yielding results. And reason being that these conflicts were government initiated. They were instead state-sponsored conflicts. As you can see from this table shows the list of massacres that have taken place in Kenya since 1980. And as you can see, from 1980 to 1994, these conflicts were state-sponsored because security agents were involved. And that's why it was difficult to broker peace, because government interfered. The approach was top-bottom approach. Communities were not involved. Communities were not, did not participate in decision making. And that's why with the community peace museums came up with an approach, a bottom-up approach, where community elders were involved in coming up with the solution now to these conflicts. And I have to say here that starting community peace museums was not easy. And Mennonite Central Committee had to, it required a lot of determination, a lot of courage, and a lot of focus. It was not easy to start peace museum. One of the reasons being that in East Africa, not only in East Africa, in many African countries, we don't have a strong history of community peace museums. And the reason being that museums are seen as places where unwanted objects or materials are deposited. So the idea of starting a museum was alien to Kenyans. But MCC had to remain focused, to remain determined, to work with communities so that they embrace this concept. So one of the challenges is that museums are seen as places where unwanted objects or materials are deposited. The other challenge is that museums are seen as places where objects associated with idolatry and fetish religion are kept. And in Kenya, where over 80% of its population are Christians, then this challenge is more, because people don't want to be associated with idolatry. The other challenge is in the shift in meaning. Once an object is removed from its original place, chances are that it loses its original meaning. They also lose their traditional values. And these objects can reinforce prejudice, can cause controversy, and even cause conflict in societies. So MCC had to remain focused so that this challenge does not affect the establishment of peace museums. The other challenge was lack of acceptance and inadequate understanding of the roles these objects played. Many people could not understand how an object can be used now to end conflict. So that was a challenge. People could not understand how objects can reconcile, can bring communities together, can make communities keep their weapons down and dialogue. So that was a big challenge. The other challenge was the judgmental attitude, which is still prevalent even today. that many people still, they don't, we have a judgmental attitude about materials displayed in museums. And the reason being that when missionaries came in Africa, they demonized these traditional objects. They were considered as fetish objects, fetish objects. So they were despised, they were rejected, some were even thrown away. So we still have that judgmental attitude. And one example I can give here is that when we were developing peace museums, there was a time we wanted to establish a peace museum in a church, but it brought some controversy because church members were not in agreement whether it was right to put a museum in a church. The other disagreement was on the kinds of objects that should be displayed, because in this church there are so many divisions. So the question was, which division of the church should we display their artifacts? So that brought a lot of controversy, and we had to move that museum to another location. But the good thing is that Mennonite Central Committee did not have any difficulty in making sense of these traditional cultural objects. In fact, what they did is that despite these challenges, they supported this initiative for over 10 years. And today we have over 12 community peace museums. Now, museums, as we see them today, they are sites for ecumenical and interfaith dialogue, because through museums, we see them as a starting point for sharing, learning, and demonstrating how peace traditions can be applied in situations of violence. So we bring communities together, and then they start sharing and learning about other communities, how other communities resolved their conflict. So we see peace museums as a starting point to learn about peace traditions of other communities and how we can use these traditions to resolve conflicts. Peace museums also provide a way to discuss how artifacts stored the knowledge of a people of a non-written tradition. Now, in this region, we don't have a history of writing books. We kept our history through objects, writing in caves, planting trees, sables. So we stored our knowledge in artifacts. So, and for us to understand this knowledge, we need to decode. So peace museums provided that avenue where people could interact with the objects and they decode the message embedded in these objects. So peace museums provided a way, or provides a way, to discuss how artifacts store this knowledge of non-written tradition. These museums also provide an avenue where the whole community could be involved in active participation in dialogue sessions. Now, what we know about peacekeeping is that it involves only a handful of people, representatives from the warring functions. And many people are left out, but with community peace museums, the entire community is involved in dialogue. So that's why we are saying that it's an avenue where the whole community participates in looking for solutions to their problems. Peace museums have also provided a venue where difficult objects could be discussed to strengthen human rights. And I'll give an example of FGM, female genital mutilation, which is practiced in many communities in Africa. The communities that practice FGM, they don't talk about it openly. And that's why the practice is still there. Though it is done in secret, it is still there. Now, what peace museums have done, they have opened this discussion, this debate about FGM. And what they've done is that they have exhibited, they have displayed objects that were used in FGM. And when people come, they get an opportunity to interact with the object, to learn how it was used and how it violated the rights of the individuals. So when people interact this way, they are empowered even to speak about it, even to educate other members of the community about these retrogressive practices. So peace museums have provided that venue, to discuss not only FGM, but other retrogressive practices in our communities. Peace museums have also helped in connecting communities. When communities visit a museum and they find objects, say an object from a community A, which is found in their communities, now they get to see the commonalities in these heritages. So through the use of artifacts, communities have gotten connected. They have found a common heritage that can make them appreciate one another. Through peace museums, marginalized groups have also been recognized. Myself, I come from a minority faith group, but through peace museums, I feel that I'm now empowered even to interact and to dialogue with other majority faith group members. Now, the same thing can be said of other minority groups, indigenous communities. Like in this picture you see here, this is a group of Maweto mothers. Maweto is a minority group in Nakaba community. These are women who marry other women. For many years, these women have been marginalized. They have been discriminated. They were not allowed to inherit property from their families. But with the involvement of community peace museums, they have now been recognized and they can now inherit property. Their children can be given bursaries. Their children can be admitted in schools. So they have been accepted by the larger community. And this is through the involvement of the peace museums and the awareness that peace museums is creating in the community. The other good thing about the peace museums is that it is bringing on board young people who are getting lost to globalization. You know, globalization is moving very fast. Globalization and modernity is moving very fast. And you're finding an entire generation of young people, getting lost. You find people who don't have culture. They don't want to associate with their traditions. And in Africa, we have a problem. We have a proverb that says, he who leaves or abandons his culture is a slave. So we have many young people who are slaves in their own cultures. But now with the peace museums, we are able now to work with these people, and they are using a lot of creativity, even in helping, to help in preserving this precious heritage. Now, as a result of this commitment and determination by the Mennonite Central Committee, now we have peace museums, established in many communities in Kenya. And one important thing is that these museums have been established in predominantly Christian communities. I've talked about the challenges of, negative attitude about traditional objects, but with the determination of the community of the Mennonite Central Committee and the community peace museums, these museums have now been accepted even by Christian communities, and we have museums established all over Kenya, even in communities which are predominantly Christians. The other good thing is that the personnel managing these museums are staunch Christians, some of whom hold leadership positions in churches. This shows that they have accepted the idea about the peace museums. They have accepted, they are now able to relate with these objects. So it's no longer an alien thing. It's part of, they have come now to even to accept these peace museums as an important institutions in our communities. The other good thing is that communities seem to have no difficulty in making sense of their traditional or religio-cultural objects. So they are even donating these objects to peace museums. Another important development is that religious narratives have played a very significant role in the development of these museums. Now you see people even quoting a biblical verse now to explain the origin of these peace museums. A good example is when the people of Israel were moving from Egypt, and when they crossed the Red Sea, they were told to build a monument. So people are able now to relate, that moment with the establishment of peace museums. And the argument is that peace museums will preserve that heritage, and it will always remind the young generation of where they have come from. Now, this is a case of ecumenical and interfaith dialogue materializing into a tangible peace museum. And this confirms that MCC is a force for global ecumenical and interfaith partnership. It also shows an openness of mind as opposed to prejudice, narrow-mindedness, and intolerance. This should be encouraged and should be emulated. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Timothy, and thank you to all three of our presenters. So we are ready to move into our question and answer period, or question and response. And there are a couple of questions that have come up in the Q&A and also in the chat. And one comment that I wanted to make, though, before we get started is we're lucky enough that Margaret de Jong, who was featured in Paul's presentation, she was the woman who helped to deliver the triplets. If you remember that photo, she's actually here with us at the conference, and she just sent a note to us panelists, and she said that I could share that with you. So what fun that she's here today. I'm actually going to start with a question that comes from Esther Aptison, because it came in the chat to me because she's not able to put it in the Q&A, and I don't want to forget about it. So Esther is asking the question this is a question for Lynn. So she says, thanks for your excellent presentation on MCC's education programming. Would you care to comment on MCC's ongoing commitment to constituency education? That is, helping North American constituents and supporters to understand more deeply the realities MCC partners are living with around the world. Has this aspect of MCC's work been successful? Does it make a difference? What is the tension between constituency education and fundraising for MCC program? Over to you, Lynn.
Oh, wow. That's a great question. I don't feel like the best person to answer it. And it's not the focus of my work, but it's important. I know we have, you could speak to this, Ruth, actually. Aren't you sort of overseeing advocacy? I think we see this whole advocacy at a variety of levels as a key part of our work. I remember struggling with this at some times in the past, this question of like telling stories in a way that like makes constituents feel good versus telling things that challenge and provoke. So I think I just acknowledge, I think it is a very important question for MCC to wrestle with it. I think we do wrestle with it. I'm not as outward facing toward that constituency and public in a lot of my day-to-day work. So there would be others who could speak more directly to how they wrestle with that. Trying to think if there's more I should say at the moment. I welcome comments from other others as well. And I might think of something more in a minute. So.
Sure, thanks, Lynn. Maybe before we move on to the next question, we can just see, I don't know, Paul, if you would have anything that you would want to respond here, and also other panelists who are MCC staff. Rick, I don't want to put you on the spot, but you're another person that I'm thinking might be able to give some response to this question as well. But Paul, I see that you've unmuted, so if you wanted.
Yeah, so I'll just give a little bit from the public health side, which is, I think it's always important to remember the situations we see around the world, the situations we see in our own community, those inequalities, those injustices, those are a choice. Like we as people choose to create the systems in which we live. I used to work for a nonprofit for a brief time in Pittsburgh, whose motto, they were an anti-hunger organization, and their motto was that hunger is a political choice. And we could say the same thing about health. And so there is often this, it's important for people to remember that this work that we support is good, and it can do a lot of good for a lot of people. But it is also only necessary because of the inequalities that exist in the world. As just like one small example within COVID, we have had enough COVID vaccines on the shelf for months now to vaccinate every high-risk person in the world, every doctor, every nurse, every person who is over 65, everyone who is at higher risk of dying. We've been able to do that. We've chosen not to as a world. And so, I think it is there is this tension, but I think it's important to speak honestly about why these kind of programs that MCC supports are necessary, and that they alone are never going to be sufficient.
Thanks, Paul. Rick, just before we move on, just wanting to see if you wanted to give any response to this question.
Well, I'm not a panelist exactly, but thank you, Ruth. Yeah, I think I'll build a little bit on Paul's comment. I think that we probably have less of a two solitudes understanding of our advocacy work and the communications and donor relations work that we try to do. So I think helping supporters understand the complexity, like Paul was just doing around health, I think is both part of our communication and our educating, as well as part of the story when we're interested in having people support us through funds raised. So I think we're probably being a bit more strategic about that, and maybe also not accepting there to be a dichotomy between, advocacy is the hard stuff and fundraising is only the good stuff, but that somehow we need to bring those together in a more intentional and strategic way. Esther won't be surprised at that answer, but thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, thanks, Rick, Lynn, and Paul, and thanks, Esther, for that excellent question. Lynn, the next question is again for you. This comes from Anna Vogt. Anna writes, Lynn, part of your background involves time with MCC in Latin America. How much of your own research and understanding about education and empowerment have been influenced by Latin American thought, such as pedagogy of the oppressed, liberation theology, etc.? Do you see these theories playing a role in MCC's education work in general?
Yeah, those things have definitely influenced me for sure. I spent 3 years working in Guatemala in a rural setting of returned refugees, where I was, part of my role was to provide some support to the local school. And one of the special things about that community that had been negotiated as part of the peace accords was they were allowed to have their own teachers, people from their own community, to be teachers in their primary school, even though they did not have like formal credentials finished yet. So they were in the process of like getting some training, but they were teaching at the same time. And I think that was just one, I think that over time just emphasized for me the value in local people owning their own education. I think, and that mentioned pedagogy of the oppressed. I mean, certainly Paulo Freire's work talking about like participatory education, work, with dialogue for education among people who are even illiterate, but and like valuing the knowledge and insight that they have. I mean, all these things are layered on top of each other for me of the end of the day, valuing local people's, I mean, people wherever they are, really knowing the best about their needs, about their situation. So that, yeah. How does that influence, what was the rest of the question? How does that influence MCC's work around the world? I mean, I guess just the idea for me that education might look different in different places. Really trusting people regardless of their academic credentials, that higher academic credentials does not necessarily mean more insight or wisdom. Some of the most insightful things I've learned from people who are illiterate or have very low level of education. So I don't know if that answers, but those are a few thoughts off the top of my head.
Thanks, Lynn. The next question is a question for anyone, it says. It's from John Eicher. John, I hope I pronounced your name correctly. He writes, it occurs to me that in MCC's early years, its promotional materials implied that the recipients of its development work could eventually live like middle-class North Americans. I'm recalling photos of MCC workers building modern dairies and other infrastructure in Africa in the 1950s. Over the last decades, there's been a shift from unsustainable/industrial, top-down, high-cost forms of development to sustainable, local, bottom-up, low-cost forms of development. For example, solar-powered fans versus central air conditioning, bikes versus cars, etc. My question is, how did local populations respond to this shift from unlimited material expectations to sustainable material expectations? And I would invite any or all of the panelists who would like to respond to this question to feel free.
Well, I can start because there's this, within health, there is a big tension here. And Paul Farmer, if any of you have read his work, was one of the co-founders of Partners in Health in Haiti, Mountains Beyond Mountains, if you've read that book. And he has a concept about, he uses a profanity here, but basically being satisfied with junk for the poor. And that much of global development is very satisfied with a two-tier system, with quality of services that we would never accept in our own communities. And I think there's a justified push to trying to make sure that we are doing, we're providing a quality of care, or a quality of services that we would be ourselves happy to participate in. And so I think there, on the less cynical side, I think there are good reasons to push ourselves towards higher quality of care, higher quality of services, which is part of what you're talking about here. But on the other hand, I think a lot of the shift from sort of these imported Western models, and this happened in health, was when we started listening more to communities about their priorities and about how they would use scarce resources, because they've always been scarce resources. So if we have a set amount of money, we can either choose to try to model something really unattainable or inappropriate to the context based on a North American model, or we can find alternatives that might be a better fit. So for example, we saw that in Haiti in disaster responses, for example, after Hurricane Matthew in 2016, we could go to the community and say, we would like to, we think it's a great idea to build houses. Would you like to have houses that are, disaster resistant and meet all the modern international standards? Like, that's fabulous. They're just really, really expensive. And so for the same amount of resources, you could choose as a community to build 5 of these houses, or we could do something different. And often communities would choose to do things that were more locally adapted, that could get them more benefit for the same resources. And so doing things like rebuilding gardens, or doing community-led efforts, or building water systems. And so I think for me, the ethical response to that question is, what do the people themselves want? And how would they use the resources if we're willing to be transparent about, okay, here are the resources we have available. What shall we do together? And from my experience, that tends to drive the discussion around how can the community best achieve its goals, rather than how do we best replicate something from another context.
Thanks, Paul. Lynn or Timothy, would either of you care to respond to the question? And I know I should just note, Timothy had indicated, I think it's because of the internet connection, that he would prefer to respond via chat. And so Timothy, because I know that we have the Q&A set up for questions, but in order for all the participants to see the response, if you have a response to the question and you'd like to include it in the chat, I think that might be a way for a response to be included there. But Lynn, in the meantime, if you'd like to respond, go for it.
Trying to think how this applies in education. I mean, I guess the question would be, if you're supporting a school, how important, I mean, question would be technology. How close to replicating like a high technology, high resource learning environment is realistic, or is needed, or is desired. And realistic is probably, I mean, it's interesting. Like, I think of some projects I think it's very natural to have an idea, even for local people in any situation, to like see something that looks very developed and high resource and say that's what we want. But I've like also seen I mean, you have examples where like a lot of money was put to like build a building, but then there's not the actual education, actual learning and program that's happening in there is not really very rich, because there's not training and we're not good pedagogy going along with it. And so like I've heard someone comment that you can have more effective learning under a tree than in a shiny classroom. I think a key question here, though, is local ownership in the decision process, which is why, like in education, I'm pushing so much this idea of school management committees or some similar structure that really gives parents and community leaders ownership, actual participation in decisions about how resources will be used and what would be the priorities. I mean, technology is such a question. I just think of technology because it's such a changing thing in education. Like recently super relevant because of COVID pandemic and all the, physical shutdowns. And you see this massive gap between people who have access and those who don't to technology, and yet it's so expensive. So really difficult to sort of roll that out instantly to everyone. So no good answers there, but those are some reflections.
Thanks, Lynn. I will, and I see that Timothy has shared local ownership guarantees sustainability. Thanks, Timothy. So Alan Epweaver has just given a further comment to Anna's earlier question about pedagogy of the oppressed, and I'll read it here. He says, Freire was a major influence on MCC staff in the 1970s, who led MCC thinking about education and development approaches more broadly. Nancy Heisey, who was mentioned, and also people like Meryl Awert, Tim Lind, and Edgar Stace. So thanks for that. Thanks for that reflection, Alan. And then a question from Anne Hirschberger. Anne, I assume that this question is also for any of the panelists who would like to respond. So correct me if I'm wrong, but that's what I'm getting here. And it says, we are rightly questioning our approaches in the past, trying to understand how our own values shaped our program structure and focus. Might we also question the ways our current values shape programs? So, for example, community ownership, safeguarding, gender equity are mechanisms of control. So that is, again, for all panelists.
It's an excellent question. And, I think part of it is, there's that metaphor or whatever that a fish can't see the water it's swimming in. I mean, it's true that it is a lot easier to look back and see our cultural biases and mistakes that were made than it is currently. One of the things in health, and health can be one of those areas where this is especially problematic because there's this idea of universality, that we all share the same body, therefore, diabetes care is diabetes care. And so there is this real push in health for universality of what we do and how we do it. But when you actually get to the community level about the real sort of trade-offs that exist, like that's not true. There is the physicality, which is the same, but health is a culturally constructed idea. What is the health that we are looking for? And when do we trade off suffering for other cultural values, for other things that are important to us? We come as Anabaptists from a tradition that has willingly died for other values. And so it's not always true that this sort of like the length of life is the ultimate value. And there are projects that really, that push the envelope on this in terms of, when are we imposing a cultural value, and when are we supporting the community in achieving something that they want to achieve in a way they want to achieve it. There'd be examples, for example, of female genital mutilation projects, where at what point is this something that the community wants, and at what point is this something that we find culturally offensive and therefore would like to change beyond health? Because if you would look at it from a purely sort of clinical perspective, there would be ways to improve those outcomes while keeping cultural traditions. And so I think there really are these very difficult questions about what culture are we bringing to it? When are we trying to impose cultural change? That's especially true as we work in issues of mental health, in trauma response, where we're really getting into community sources of resilience and how they make sense of pain and the intersection of health and culture. And so, yeah, I think it's something to be very, very careful of, and to always be skeptical whenever there's an impulse to control, whenever there's an impulse to set a standard, whenever there's an impulse for us to impose a priority that the community is not talking about, or the people that would be effective are not prioritizing. I think we should at least be skeptical. And maybe there's good reasons for pushing for cultural change, but we should at least own that ambiguity, I think.
I can give a few thoughts. So might we also question the ways our current values shape programs? Community ownership, safeguarding gender equity, are mechanisms of control. I think I have two thoughts. One is changing the we, and the other is power. I mean, mechanism of control is power. So I think, these current values, I think community ownership, safeguarding gender equity were things I had mentioned. I think yes, maybe in 50 years, we'll look back and say they were missing the mark, but I think they are coming a long way. And in response to giving voice to people who did not have a voice or power in the past. So, if you look at the board meetings or the decision maker meetings of MCC 50 or 80 years ago or 100 years ago, it was all white men, right? So the fact that table is somewhat changes the values that are getting priority. And I think we still have a long way to go. So that's why I would say, I think focus on the we and keep expanding that we. Who is it that is not having power and is not being part of the decisions, that is not, whose perspective is not shaping these values that we're prioritizing. So I would say, I think we're doing a better, we're making an attempt at that now, let's put it that way. And that's the journey we need to continue on, is expanding the we and shining light on the power imbalances and working to equalize.
Thanks, Lynn. And just wanting to note, unfortunately, I see that Timothy Gachanga is no longer in this session. I wonder if he's had internet issues. Ben, if you'd be able to maybe just touch base with him, I just want to make sure that we're not missing him here, but I'll just keep going with the questions. Thanks for the folks who are responding, in the Q&A with really excellent questions. So the next one, I don't know who it's from an anonymous attendee, and it says, how is MCC educating white North Americans away from our colonial mentality and work abroad and with people of color in North America? So I would say this is perhaps a question again for both of you, Lynn and Paul, if you have any response to that question.
Similar, it's a great question, and yeah, it's very needed, because as I was saying before, I think these reasons we're doing our work are not disconnected from the inequalities and the colonialism and racism and misogyny and all the other structures of inequity that have created the world we find ourselves in. And so it is important to be looking upstream at those things. Within global health, there is huge arrogance in the field. If you look at, one of the best known institutions, Johns Hopkins, like their slogan is "Lives saved, millions at a time." But when we look at, what are the global health institutions, have their roots, their very foundations are in colonial medicine. And the purpose of colonial medicine was not primarily to help those people for their own sake, but to help the colonial enterprise. The same thing is true of many of those sort of fundamental structures to support, marginalized or minority groups in North America and Canada. The reason governments cared about those was not out of some sense of benevolence, but part of these systems of control. And so I think whenever we engage with systems of inequity like that, or whenever we engage with institutions that have that kind of baggage, including MCC itself, as we've learned in this conference, like we should have questions, and we should be skeptical about that, and we should not try to present these things as unnuanced or as disconnected from those difficult histories. And so, what should we do to educate? I think it's a both and. I don't think it's that we stop responding and only sort of work on sort of that advocacy education front. I think it's why both matter, and they both connect, because as we were hearing in some of the presentations yesterday in terms of working with Indigenous neighbors, it's not just about acknowledging that bad things happen. It's about actually doing something to undo those oppressive systems. And so I don't think it can be an either or. At least that's how I'd come at it from a health perspective.
Thanks, Paul. Lynn, would you have a response to that one, or would you like us to keep going here?
This is the one on educating white North Americans.
Yeah.
Away from, I mean, it's I think MCC's working hard on trying to educate itself. I mean, I think working internally is at the same time as working externally is important, and there are things MCC is doing to work at that. Obviously, a long way to go. I mean, I noticed like almost all the panelists here are white. And so, right there, it's still a pretty small table. I wish we could hear more from Timothy. I'd love to hear his thoughts beyond what he can just type in a few words there. I think MCC's been working at this for a long time. I mean, it's a long-term process, and I was just remembering back, when I was first working with MCC in the 90s. I guess that's when like Damascus Road was starting, and I remember hearing this idea. Like, on one hand, it was an external-facing thing, right, where it was like doing work with various groups and Mennonite-related groups. in constituency, and then hearing this idea, oh, when Damascus Road work came back to work with like MCC itself, it was actually like the hardest place to work. So I think we just work at this very, very humbly and looking inward as much as outward. So.
Thanks, Paul. And I agree. I wish that we could hear more from Timothy. Unfortunately, Ben is not able to get a response from him yet, and he's not connected here. So I'm going to move on to the next question, which is from Rick Hober-Bauman, and it says, it's again for any panelist, and it says, all three of you describe directions that do not require as many people from Canada or the US to deliver MCC program internationally. If that trend continues, might we need to think differently about how MCC is known, cared about, and supported in Canada and the US?
I think this is fascinating because, yes, I mean, I think it maybe comes down to thinking about what is the role of the North American in, whatever international program you have. Because I think if you have the idea that like local people can and should be at every level of the process and involved in the process and owning the process, you can take that all the way to saying, well, why should North Americans be there at all? And I think the value there at the same time, there's like tremendous value, like for all this mutual learning and all this. I mean, my life perspective, everything has been transformed and influenced through living in Guatemala, living in Bolivia. Regardless of where that is, like that interaction that engages, that engagement across differences is so important. And so having opportunity for that, like I remember when I came back from Guatemala feeling like, I think the most significant thing out of all of this was any learning I can bring back to my bubble here in Pennsylvania that is so oblivious to this situation there. So if we have no connection, that's not good either. So, but how to continue that connection, but in a much more partnership, equal, in a way that's really eyes wide open to those power differences and all that is so critical. And it informs the people in the US, how MCC is known, cared about, and supported in the US. Very good question.
The two examples of, I think, that point to an answer to this question from my experience in Haiti. One is, if we're talking about engagement, we look at two different models of going for short term, there's learning tours, and then there's work or mission visits. And in Haiti, with our local staff and our partners, we made the very explicit decision that if people came for these sort of short-term things, they're coming to learn. They're not adding value really in a short-term thing. And so if we, but it can be transformative for them. And so we had a lot of learning tours come, but sort of acknowledging from the very first that this is for your benefit. This is for the purpose of you learning and being able to share these stories back. And not that you're coming and painting a building is something that the community couldn't do on its own. And the fact that, your plane tickets could have hired a person for a year is, we need to be transparent about that expense of resources and why that is important. And I think it puts the onus back on what Lynn was saying. What do you take back from this? And I think MCC's done a good job of trying to put that emphasis, be transparent about what is the interaction here about. And that is one way where people from the constituency in North America, when we were in Haiti, really experienced, and it was profound, and it shaped their giving, and it shaped their connections to those communities in ways that wouldn't have been possible virtually. The second thing I would say is, in terms of this like service worker model, is really pushing again towards that local decision making. And so while we were in Haiti, we would sit down with partners and talk to them about what is their priority. What does it cost to have a service worker come and work in your project? Would you actually prefer that? Or would you prefer the money to hire someone locally? And I think if you give people that kind of decision, it was really interesting. Sometimes folks would really want that sort of an international person who could be a bridge to contexts they didn't know about, who could maybe help them with skills that were difficult to find locally. And the service worker doesn't have to be North American. We had folks from Cambodia and we had folks from Mozambique, from all over, who were part of our team as service workers, as well as folks from North America. And I think I think we can answer some of those ethical questions by putting the folks we're supposedly, we're there to help, or we're there to support, to put them in the driver's seat of that decision. Do they want learning tours? Do they think that's valuable and worth their time? Would they like to have an international service worker, or could those resources be better spent on someone local?
I'm just going to add, I'm just noticing again, reading Rick's question, and the focus on known, cared about, and supported in Canada, US. So definitely speaking, you have a good executive director hat on, Rick, thinking of where does the support come from at the end of the day? It's and how significant is it for, why do people trust MCC and believe in what MCC is doing? People in Canada and the US who are giving money to MCC, what is it that motivates that? And how significant is that connection personally to someone who has lived somewhere with MCC and told them about it and had that connection? I imagine that is a very significant motivator and source of trust in MCC. So just want to acknowledge, I think that is important. It doesn't have to be lost just because sort of changing the power role. In fact, it might increase trust as people sort of hear the attention being paid to how to do that well.
Thanks, Lynn. All right, a question from Tina Fairkaler. Tina writes, and again, a question for both of you. How does development and peace work by NGOs shape the government's response to support the people in their country? Understanding, of course, that colonialism has wreaked havoc on countries' abilities to govern and manage their own resources. Some have criticized NGOs that their work abdicates the governing authorities from their role in this support, or that the people are mollified by the help they receive, and thus are not brought to the point of demanding better from their own governments or demanding the release of their countries from the hold of forces like the World Bank. What are your thoughts?
Well, I'll start by yes, it's a great question. And Haiti is known, sort of one of the ways it is described even internally is the Republic of NGOs, that NGOs within Haiti have more power, more money than the government does in many cases. And that is a self-perpetuating system. Because really the services people see provided are not provided by the government for the most part. And so there is little appetite for paying more taxes or those sort of things. So yes, it's a very real dynamic, and one that there's not great answers to, because part of it is this, short-term versus long-term kind of a thing, because yes, theoretically, the government of Haiti should provide education to every Haitian child. Yes, theoretically, the government of Haiti should have clinics and some form of healthcare that is available to people. But that's not the case. And it's a pretty long, mental gymnastics to try to have the thread of okay, if we stopped providing this now, when and how does that actually translate into that ideal taking shape? And I think what we see in many contexts is it doesn't. So most communities in rural Haiti have basically no government intervention whatsoever, but also most rural communities in Haiti have no NGO engagement either, and it's not dramatically changing the situation. And so, yeah, most NGOs, most missions, most churches in Haiti, they work where they can get their car to. And so there tends to be these around roads, major cities, that's where the resources tend to stop for both the government and nonprofit sectors. And so, yeah, I think it's not a clear line of causality where it could be ethically justifiable just to stop, because then hypothetically the government's gonna stand in there. But I think it's important, and I think MCC's gotten better at this, to link action with advocacy, and so that you really you are drawing attention to those realities and not trying to pretend that like the solution we have or the work that we're doing is the ideal situation. Like it's not. We shouldn't need to support child malnutrition programs in Haiti. Like that is an injustice and an inequality, the fact that children are becoming malnourished because the economy is such that the government is not providing those kind of resources. Like it is only because of that wrong that this work exists the way it does. And I think trying to make sure there's awareness of that locally, in talks with government and in relationships to our constituency in North America. But at the same time, I don't know quite what the alternative is for those communities at that time. I don't think we've seen great examples of where a full-scale pullback has really forced the government to step up. What we see in contexts where the government can't, or where NGOs can't act, tends to be just an absence. And you look at a lot of countries where violence is at such a point, insecurity is at such a point that NGOs don't go there. It's not like the government is magically stepping in and taking care of those people. They tend to just be they fall through the cracks. So it's an excellent question, and I don't have a great answer to it, but that's how I would respond.
I think with education, this is one of the ideas behind sort of this, I mentioned this shift from private school to public school system. And it's not that we don't support any private schools, but I just see a lot of value in finding opportunities to strengthen and support the public system. I think Haiti, if I understand right, is really exceptionally weak in terms of public government supported education, at least across Latin America. I think it's like, what did you say? 85% or something of students attend private school. Like it's just complete reverse of like a lot of places. So I think many countries at least have the intent of an education ministry that is attempting to provide education and looking for ways to strengthen that. I think are the most sustainable approach. The other idea of the school management committee, like the local, there's numerous places where that kind of structure is like in theory mandated or in theory like laid out in the education ministry sort of plan, but just not really effectively happening in a lot of communities. And so that's a way to just help that process to happen. I know I'm thinking of Nepal as a project that has really worked on doing that in some rural communities where there's like whole steps laid out in the ministry documents of like the role of the local community committee, in making decisions about the school, but it's just not happening. And so helping that to happen is a way to like help this happen, exactly what it's saying here in the question, demanding better from their government and getting those resources to the local school. Just one other thought I have is, I think it's also, we have this more recently, this like strategic direction of focusing on uprooted and displaced people. Obviously, that's something MCC has been doing throughout its whole century, but it seems like that is a particular context and situation, and with uprooted and displaced people, where the system is like it is sort of extra stressed and really needs temporary support, although too often those turn into really long-term situations. But I think it is an argument for focusing on those kind of points that are understandably really stretched, rather than just sort of general poverty situations where it's like, well, the local government, local community needs to resolve this or needs to work at this over the long term. And just bringing a solution from outside isn't really helping that happen.
Thanks, Lynn and Paul. And Anna Vogt, the director of MCC Canada's Peace and Justice Office, also writes, in response to this question, MCC also works to pay attention to and support partner-led local advocacy. Many MCC partners engage in advocacy towards their own governments around access to health, education, etc., as part of their programming. So thanks for that, Anna. Well, folks, I know that the presenters and I had talked about how it was thinking this was going to be a very long session, and not thinking we were in no way going to fill the full 2 hours, but here we are with just 4 minutes to spare. We have answered all of the questions that are in the Q&A. If there's one final question that anyone would have to pose, either to post it in the Q&A or to simply unmute and raise the question, you're welcome to do so.
Should read Laura Comer's response in the chat.
Thank you. That's right. Thanks, Lynn. I had noted that. Yes. And Laura had given that response to Esther's question. I can read this aloud for everyone. In further response to Esther's earlier question about the perceived tension between advocacy and fundraising, MCC's Communications and Donor Relation team believes that there's a common value held by donors and advocates, and even program staff and partners, a vision for a better and more hopeful future, a passion for peace building, a compassion for our neighbors. Our goal is to offer multiple paths for people to engage in this vision. Our invitation is for people to give, serve, pray, learn, and advocate. We believe all these pathways are critical to create positive change. Well, not seeing any other questions pop up here in the Q&A. And not hearing any voices, I'm going to suggest that maybe we are going to end this session with just a couple of minutes to spare here. I want to thank Paul and Lynn and Timothy for your excellent presentations, and also for the entire group of participants. Really excellent questions that we had here. I think there was some really rich discussion and conversation that really covered the breadth of, as we said, programmatic shifts across the century, and thinking about what does where we have been tell us about where we're going. So I just want to thank each and every one of you, and welcome you to all take a break. And for those who are interested, feel free to come back on. Ben, can you remind us? Thank you. The break is from after the break, then starting at 1:30 Central Time for the next discussion, which is around agriculture and religion. Thanks to all, and enjoy.